Trump's threat to impose the 30% tariffs blindsided the EU, especially after talks had reportedly made progress. What triggered, do you think, this sudden escalation? And what does it say about Trump's trade strategy?
Well, it says that Trump is focused, smart, aggressive in the American sense. So maybe in the old-fashioned French, British sense, aggressive is a critique, is negatively connoted. But in American English, being aggressive is good. It means you're a smart, shrewd investor or military leader. And so he's putting his finger where it hurts, right? And so he's accelerating the psychological pressure on the Europeans because he knows that they are divided. He knows that they are weak and disorganized. And so he's hitting them where it hurts the most, right? To make a long story short, it boils down to what economists and military strategists call game theory. What does it mean, game theory? It means you have two players here. You have the Trump White House, and you have the European Commission. But the European Commission is not alone. You have an added layer, which you could say are the two or three biggest governments in Europe, Western Europe to be precise, which are Germany, France, and Italy. They are also negotiating, quote unquote, directly with Washington behind the back of the European Commission. So you have like a theater, and Trump, because they are trying, the Italians and the French.
So you have like basically three players.
Because they're negotiating behind back with Washington, he knows they are divided. So of course, because he knows they are divided, it's going to be easy for him to rip them. Another issue is, I think, the timing. The timing is very good for America and very bad for the European Union. Why? Because the economic growth engine of Europe now is practically at zero. So Germany, Italy, France are no longer growing their economies. And of course, it's not something that happened today. I think the Eurozone, the EU, has been plagued by low GDP growth for the past 3-4 years. But clearly, in the past 6 months, there has been an acceleration of the decline of Europe, and the problem of slow or zero growth is now plaguing all of Italy, Germany, and France, and Trump knows that. So he's potentially declaring a 30%, gigantic trade war on Europe at the worst possible time for them.
For the Europeans. Well, Sir, Macron urged the EU to prepare for a trade war, while Italy's Meloni still believes in negotiations. How divided do you see this as the EU internally, and how could this affect the bloc's ability to respond with a united front, do you think?
I think they are very divided, very bureaucratic, very disorganized, and I think they will lose. They will lose not because Trump is a genius, because Trump is focused, right? So if you're a policymaker, if you're a businessman, if you're leading a group, be it a company or a nation, the key to success is focus. And Trump knows that. So what has he done in the past 6 months since he entered the White House? In a very brutal, aggressive way, he decided to focus all or most of America's military, financial, intellectual resources on the new great game. And that new great game is pitting China against America. That is the future. That is the long-term trend, the Chinese-American rivalry.
Yes.
And Europe is becoming increasingly irrelevant. In the short term, in the medium term, he believes that the European Union is profiting from America, and he no longer wants them to profit from America, so he's hitting them. How is he hitting them? He closed the UK chapter. So a month ago, he signed a trade deal with Britain. So he, in essence, strategically, he created a wedge, a separation between the British and the EU. So Europe is no longer united because now Britain already settled its trade deal with America. He did the same in Asia with Vietnam, the most important nation among Southeast Asian countries. He signed a trade deal 2 weeks ago with them, and he already had a trade deal with Singapore. So now Indonesia, Malaysia are isolated, and they are desperate for a trade deal with America. What happened yesterday in Brussels, 2 days ago in Brussels, the EU federal capital? Ursula von der Leyen, she was receiving for 2 days the President Subianto, right? The Indonesian president. And she thought that it was smart because she thought that by receiving, President Subianto, the leader of Indonesia, in Brussels for 2 days and treating him almost like a king, she would send a message to Washington. Of course, she's wrong, and that's ridiculous because Indonesia is not.
Sorry to interrupt you. What message would she, if you can just elaborate more, what message would she be trying to convey?
A very silly message. So she thought she was telling Trump, look, if you slap 30% taxes on Europe, we, quote unquote,
other partners,
we can sign a free trade deal with Indonesia and Malaysia as a retaliation. That is very silly, very silly, because Indonesia represents less than 1% of the trade flows from and into European companies. America represents a big, like a gigantic percentage of the trade and investment flows for Italy, Germany, and France. Put simply, the economies of Germany, Italy, and France cannot survive a trade war with America, but America's economy can survive a trade war with the EU. What does it tell you? That on August 1st,
sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to the next question, which is related to what you were just about to mention, is that the EU Trade Commissioner, Šefčovič, warned that the 30% tariffs would devastate the supply chains. Would you be able to explain the real economic impact on the industries both in Europe and the US?
Well, in the US, it's limited because the US is like a continent. So we describe, we perceive America as a nation, but we should perceive it as a gigantic continent, right? And the same is true of Russia, by the way. So when the Europeans slapped sanctions on Russia, stupidly, they thought that Russia would collapse in 2 weeks. But Russia is a continent. The same applies to America. America is a huge continent, and the US economy is very diversified, and that sector industrial diversification acts as a risk reduction. So when your economy is diversified across sectors and geographies, that reduces the overall risks of a trade war. Another good thing for America is not an export-oriented country. So the machine, the core heart of the American economy, that engine, that growth engine of America, it can function even without trade. It's better to have trade, but even without trade, the American growth engine can work. It's not at all the case of Italy, France, and Germany. Without free trade, without exports to America, they will collapse in a few days.
Yeah.
So clearly the balance of power is in favor of Trump here.
Yeah. Well, the EU has also suspended retaliatory tariffs until August the 1st, and which is the same date Trump's tariffs are set to take effect. How effective is this pause as a negotiation tactic? And do you think it reflects weakness, patience, or a strategic discipline, maybe?
No, I think it's weakness. And when you are negotiating with someone fierce and ultra-focused like Trump, you should not be weak. And I think that fact is a sign of weakness. Saying, because what they're telling Trump is, we have a list of companies and sectors, and you know what? If you hit us on August 1st, we will hit you, but we don't want to hit you. What kind of language is that? So if you make a threat, you should tell your rival or your enemy, you know what? This is my threat, and on August 1st, I'm going to implement that threat, and I'm going to hit you. You don't make a threat and say, by the way, sorry, we don't want to threaten you. So that kind of talk is very silly.
Yeah. Well, the EU is intensifying trade agreements with countries like, as you just mentioned earlier, Indonesia, Japan, and Vietnam, and has mega deals in progress with the Mercosur and Mexico. Is Brussels, do you think, seriously pivoting away from the US?
No, I think it's silly. I think it's gesticulation, right? silly theater. Why is it silly theater? Because these trade deals to bear fruit. So when planting a seed in economics and finance, you wait for some quarters or years to get the yield, right?
Yep.
The trade deals with Indonesia and Malaysia, they will take 20 or 30 years to bear fruits, right? August 1st is in 6 weeks. So you have something terrible happening in 6 weeks, and you're telling Trump, we don't care because we're planting seeds that will give us returns in 20 years. So of course, it's ridiculous, it's silly.
As you can see, we've seen this phenomenon before, that Trump imposes tariffs and then suspends them to reopen talks, and now he issues letters with delayed implementation dates. What does this pattern tell us about his negotiating style, and how is the EU? How should the EU actually read this his next move, do you think?
I think the EU made many mistakes. The biggest one was to underestimate Trump. Trump himself made a mistake on April 2nd when he started that aggressive realignment and reordering of world trade. He made one mistake, Trump. He tried to fight multiple wars on multiple fronts at the same time. So he declared a trade war on Britain, England, Vietnam, China, Europe, all at the same time. Now, today, it's a smarter Trump and it's a stronger Trump. Why is he stronger? Because he already got in his bag a trade deal with the UK. That's done. He has a trade deal with Vietnam and Singapore. That is done. So now he can focus more aggressively on Europe and hit them hard. And also, what he has from China is a truce. So 5 weeks ago in Geneva, the Americans and the Chinese met, and they agreed to a truce. What is that truce? The Chinese are telling the Americans, we will give you rare earth minerals if you give us advanced microchips. Trump said, yes, we have a deal. That deal may not be permanent, but it will last for the next 9 months or for the next 12 months. So for the next 12 months, Trump has a truce with the Chinese. So the Chinese are out of the game for the next 9 or 12 months. So Europe is alone, the poor Europeans are alone. And that's why Trump is hitting them very hard. He knows there's no hope for them. And he knows that the British, the English, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Singaporeans, they will do nothing to help Europe. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, they will do nothing to come to Europe's rescue. So poor Europe is really alone.